Jay Dyer runs jaysanalysis.com and is the author of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex Cults, and Symbols in Film. He also hosts a show on Gaia TV called Hollywood Decoded. Jay, welcome to Saturday Night Trad.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Jay, I want to start with a brief story. When I was younger, I would go to the movie store with my father, and I would see all these posters on the wall of these different movies, and I kind of had this idea in my head that when you start out as a kid, you watch G-rated movies, then you graduate to PG, and then PG-13, and then R, and you sort of are initiated into different levels of sexual impurity and violence and even occultism, but in the end, it's all just kind of a fun, entertaining thing. In your research, how did you come across the idea that it's not simply entertainment?
That's a good question. I would say probably like you, I didn't think of it as a cult or anything nefarious for most of my youth. I just thought, that's what it is. It's just movies, it's entertainment, whatever. And then as I got older, and around age 18, I started reading the Bible and trying to get a little more serious about what I understood to be Christianity at that time. And it started becoming clear to me that Hollywood films had a spiritual agenda. And so even though I was immature and naive and kind of had a goofy evangelical worldview at the time, I did correctly understand that. I remember vividly sitting at a movie with my girlfriend when I was, I think, 18. And I had just been reading through the New Testament for the first time. And I was watching that movie with Al Pacino and Keanu Reeves, Devil's Advocate.
Yeah.
That, here's this movie about the Antichrist. And looking back now, the movie is very cheesy. But at the time, I remember thinking, well, this is actually... in a way, biblical. I mean, the movie presents it in a stupid, unbiblical way, but the idea of the Antichrist is biblical. So I was, beginning to make the connection, around age 18 that there's something spiritual going on with Hollywood to some degree. And, I was never really into horror movies per se or anything like that. I just liked regular, action movies, science fiction movies. But so I went to college and I studied things like philosophy and comparative religion, and I did take film classes because I was still interested in movies, and I studied geopolitics and espionage and all this stuff, and it all kind of coalesced where I was realizing that all of these things are actually related. There's not a separate realm of the arts that's not related to spiritual warfare worldviews or any of the stuff that you mentioned. They're all connected, and so it was just a long process really of researching the connections that I never would have dreamed are actually truly there. And then, when you get into the stuff like cults and Hollywood cults and this kind of stuff, it's much deeper and darker than I ever would dream.
One of the things I've noticed is the detail and elaborate use of ancient occultism. In my own day job, I'm doing academic research into Renaissance magic, and the Neoplatonic magic of theurgy is present in Puppet Master, the Puppet Master series. The Evil Dead, I think, has the Chaldean oracles. I'm not sure, or maybe it's the Mnemonocracy.
It's supposed to be the Necronomicon.
Okay. Yeah, but it's weird that there's so how do these movie directors and writers know so much about the occult?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I did a lot of grad work myself looking at Elizabethan and Renaissance era works. So I've read Cornelius Agrippa, and I've read all those characters like John Dee and so forth. And what you start to realize is that there's kind of a loose tradition or train of thought that comes out of that Elizabethan Renaissance tradition that has influenced a lot of acting in Hollywood, believe it or not. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I interviewed a girl who was studying she's getting her, I think, her PhD or something crazy in Elizabethan stage drama. She, not just in terms of academics, but she's also an actress. Oh. So we had a long discussion about this because she was illustrating that at this point that this is kind of the heart, the core of the tradition of acting in the West. In other words, that you can talk about Stanislavski and the Stanislavski method and how it tries to, implement ideas from the occult, but that's still only like 100 years old. The tradition of the stage, we think back to Globe Theater, we think back to Shakespeare.
Yes.
And that period with people like Ben Jonson, John Donne, Marlowe, a lot of these people were writing various types of hermetic, alchemical, all kinds of esoteric plays that were to be used and done at things like the masked ball. So if you are familiar with like the ideas of what's in Eyes Wide Shut, you have that orgy scene of the masked ball. Yes. And the masked ball goes back to the Elizabethan drama period where the elites were, doing orgies and so forth. And anyway, so the point of all this is just to say that I think that the Western acting tradition really has its roots in Shakespeare, Globe Theater, Ben Jonson, John Donne, and many of these characters, not all, but many of them were very influenced by the occult, by esotericism, by Neoplatonism, and that's why alchemy, and that's why you see this flowering of this tradition throughout Hollywood, is that it's really been there all along. It's just not really well known.
Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts about the connection between magic and the occult and intelligence, American intelligence in the 20th century? And it seems strange that also has its roots deeper in the 19th century, even back to the 16th century in British intelligence.
Absolutely, yeah. This is something that I do cover in the book, as well as like the masked ball tradition that we just spoke of. I have an essay that I did a long time ago called Cryptography of the Cryptocracy. And what I do in that essay is I get into the history of ciphers, codes, cryptography, and how this tradition of symbols and symbol manipulation has a very close relationship to the development of the computer. And so if you read old essays by Leibniz, I have some analyses of old Leibniz essays where he kind of predicts the idea of the computer. And now the reason that's relevant is that these characters were all studying hermetic arts and so forth. And so you can very clearly see the relationship that you're talking about when we look at things like the development of the computer, because you have a direct connection between ciphers, cryptography, and the secret code languages that spies would use. And I think that even the Enochian symbolism of John Dee was, at least in part, used to convey secret messages based around spying for Elizabeth. So I'm not saying that John Dee was completely a phony. He may have taken some of his occultism seriously, but at least in some aspect of it, it was used for the purpose of relaying secret messages back to Elizabeth. And there's actually NSA articles that I cite in my essay. You can find scholarly essays at the NSA's archives about the history of John Dee and cryptography and how this relates to the development of the computer. So in other words, there's one example right there where spies, intelligence agencies, surveillance, cults, all tie together in the development of the computer.
And John Dee returns in the form of James Bond. Is that correct?
That is correct. He would sign his symbol as a 007, and this is a two-ball and a cane, two-ball cane in the Masonic tradition. And so, yes, that's absolutely 100% true. That is the origin of the idea of 007. When Ian Fleming was, writing that into the story, that is absolutely where he got it from.
Well, is it the case that these occultic groups work together with intelligence? I mean, who's really in charge? Is it the cults or the government, or is this kind of interlaced?
I think they're all interlaced because you can have individuals who will be a part of multiple societies and groups and foundations. So you might have a character like Maurice Strong, who, for example, is involved in New Age groups, and he's also involved in the Club of Rome, and he also works for the Rockefeller Foundation. You have a character who's promoting the green agenda, the Rockefeller agenda, Club of Rome depopulation agenda, and he's also, hanging out with New Agers, and so it just depends, I think, really on the person. I mean, it's fine to talk about secret societies and cults, but we have to also remember that these are just kind of ideas, and that they're made up of individual people. So I would say in the case of a character like John Dee, you have somebody who was all of these things at once. He was a con man at the same time as he probably took some of the occult seriously, at the same time as he was a spy, at the same time as he was, a government official, right? So, I mean, all these things kind of combine in to be multiple facets of different roles that certain characters can play. And we see this now, even in the modern era, with people who, go from acting to being inside of a cult, something like Scientology, where they play a high role in Scientology. And then, looks like, guess what? There's a good chance that a lot of A-list actors might actually be spies. At least that's what a lot of my research has indicated. And then when we look at the history of famous actors, many of them absolutely have been spies. So it's not that much of a reach.
So you don't think there's like a room like in the X-Files where all these men are like the Fritz Springmeier's Illuminati bloodlines, like they're all sitting in a room smoking cigars and they control the whole world or anything like that?
There is and there isn't. It's hard to say because, I mean, for example, I would say somebody like David Rockefeller is very powerful, probably one of the most powerful men in America. Well, before he passed away, obviously. Yeah. But I don't have any evidence that proves or should suggest that David Rockefeller was an occultist. I would say that he was kind of above that level of control where he had a lot of money and power and influence, but as best I can tell from the way he lived and operated, he was just a pragmatic kind of atheist. So I think that some of the power players are pragmatic atheists, but I also think some of those big power players do actually take their Satanism, Luciferianism seriously, and they actually do, have a kind of ritual magic worldview. Not all of them, but some of them certainly do. So I guess it just depends on person by person, but I don't think that there's necessarily one single group that controls everything in the world, but certainly there are different power blocks. There's the Western Atlanticist power block, CFR, Trilateral Commission, World Society. This group is very powerful, and I would say that they include a lot of high-level Masons, a lot of atheists, and some Satanists and Luciferians.
After listening to a lot of your talks and doing research into these issues, I've gone back and watched a lot of old movies I used to watch when I was a kid, like John Wayne movies, and all kinds of, especially in regard to sexual stuff that I didn't pick up when I was younger. Was there ever a golden age of Hollywood? Is it true that a lot of a lot of baby boomers would be like, well, Disney, John Wayne movies, or did those movies also have occult elements and were reflective of a corrupt Hollywood lifestyle?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, as a Catholic, I'm sure you are aware of the codes that used to be enforced that were influenced by Catholic ideas. There was even, I believe, Pius the 11th or 12th. One of the popes had an encyclical about movies.
Yes.
So it's kind of hit and miss. I don't know that there was one specific era where it was all rosy per se. But I mean, that's really kind of been the history of the stage and the arts anyway, is that they've always tended to be used in somewhat, well, maybe not in the Middle Ages. I think there was, for a long period at least, the dominance of Christian worldview in the arts. But back to ancient Greece, it was it was done for the purpose of honoring the gods, and as an actor, you were trying to invoke the god, basically. Plato has a dialogue about this very thing called Ion.
Yeah.
And I would say that, like if you look at early canon law, a lot of the church fathers would say that a Christian shouldn't attend the theaters, and of course some rigorists take this to mean that you can watch a movie or something like that, but what they were talking about was, in that time, to attend the theaters actually involved a kind of commitment to some form of idolatry. You had to, thank the gods, or it was actually a participation in the rituals of the gods, to go to the plays. So I don't think that that's necessarily, I think that's a little superstitious in terms of, like, if you watch a movie, you're not necessarily damning your soul or anything like that. But I do think that, unfortunately, what happened in the history of Hollywood is that it became a very powerful tool for propaganda. And unlike many analysts, I don't lay this only at the feet of Jews. I think that actually you can find plenty of powerful interests like the CIA as more equally or more powerful than Jews and Zionists who had an interest in using Hollywood as well. So in other words, it's not like it was ever necessarily rosy. Certainly some movies are fine and promote good messages, but it's just kind of a mixed bag. So I would actually, I guess I would say no, I don't really think there is a rosy golden age.
What about the idea of, there's a term Joe Atwell uses, lifetime actor. I mean, do you think that there are people who are groomed from an early age and promoted, that it's not simply the case that someone comes from Nebraska or something to Hollywood and becomes a star, that there are people kind of chosen and marketed?
I would say that people that are like Hollywood royalty, or they grow up in a very privileged, wealthy family or something like that. Somebody like Anderson Cooper, being from the Vanderbilt family, he was kind of groomed to be what he is. So I wouldn't say that I don't think it's not like somebody was chosen when they were 10 and then like this all-powerful agency says, 100% what role they will play and everything in their life is planned out. I think that if you look at examples like when Bill Clinton was running for governor, the Rockefellers had a lot of power. They spotted him. Bill Clinton was invited to Bilderberg, and he was groomed. And Bill Clinton learned how to play that role because he learned how the world really works. Okay. And so in the same way, Anderson Cooper learned how the world really works, and he learned it. But I don't necessarily think that entails everything that Atwell's theory of this is. I think he maybe doesn't give enough allowance for individual. It's not like every single person's role is chosen for them. People, can make decisions and choose. We see plenty of wealthy, elite family members who have a bad end. They don't accept their quote roles. They do other things. They, not everybody perfectly fits into some chessboard, as if every single aspect of life is controlled like that.
What is your view on Disney and Walt Disney? I know people make some pretty bold claims about Disney being a Mason, Disney being a Satanist, that children are stolen from Disney World and Disneyland, that the Mouseketeers is kind of like a stable for grooming. What are your thoughts on Disney?
I think that it's an institution that had its beginnings with the approval of the deep state. So it's not that Walt Disney, in other words, Walt Disney wasn't a lifetime actor who, didn't start a company and all this was created for him. He started the company and he did what he did. And the company grew, and it got to a certain point where, that was a time when they realized that they could do a lot of social engineering through entities like Disney. In other words, Hollywood and people in intelligence agencies, social engineering people, if you read Bernays' propaganda, they had figured out this stuff a long time ago, back in the teens, 20s, how to use the camera, how to do all this stuff. So they already had a very sophisticated view of how to manipulate people through the arts. And so I think Disney and his company fit a perfect role. And I will only say what I can really back up in my research, which is that there's a 100% proof of Disney working directly with the Pentagon just to promote Americanism, to promote the dogma of the Pentagon, basically, ever since the days of Walt himself. So I don't really think that it matters whether Disney was a demole. I think as far as I'm aware, he was only in the demole. I don't think he was a full-fledged 33rd degree Masonry. I've never seen any evidence of that, but it doesn't really matter because he's promoting essentially Americanism. And this is, if you read David Wemhoff's book about John Courtney Murray and the CIA's doctrinal warfare program, I mean, this was essentially what changed the Catholic Church as a whole. So Disney played a big role in that, just insofar as it promoted Americanism. Now, as to the deeper, darker stuff, I think that certainly since Walt passed away, and there are Bernard Barith awards for Walt, so I don't buy this argument that he was some Nazi. I think it's silly. I mean, they made Disney cartoons that promoted anti-Nazism. So
Yeah.
I just think he was an agent of Americanism. Is really the best explanation for what Walt Disney is. I mean, isn't it just perfectly American? There's nothing more American than Disney and the promulgation of homosexuality around the globe. So Walt that's how I see him, and then I see the entity post Walt as just going even further down that dark train of being an organization geared towards social engineering. We see this with all of the weird sex stuff nowadays. Obviously, yes, I think there's probably proof that a lot of these Disney stars have had handlers, and this goes back to like Elvis. If you look at the way Elvis changed from the time that he was in the military to when he left the military and came back to became a pop star, he had this colonel who was his manager, controlling handler agent this whole time, who was giving him all these drugs. And I think that the same thing happens in the stables of the Disney organization, that these pop stars, they're drugged and they're rolled out. But it's not like they have to be completely programmed to, what they're supposed to say at this point, this point, this point. I mean, they're already creatures of a degenerate culture anyway. So they're already programmed, is what I'm trying to say. So in other words, we don't have to have a lifetime actor of Miley Cyrus, because Miley Cyrus is already a creature of Americanism.
Yes. Why do you think so many people, especially the older generations, have such a strong emotional attachment to Disney? It seems like, in a certain sense, the Disney characters have replaced Christian saints, have replaced any traditional cultural figures.
Because of the power of reminiscence, and the power of nostalgia, and the power of capturing the imagination. So one of the CIA doctors, Gregory Bateson, made this point in one of his books about capturing man's imagination. And he said that that would be the real way that we would control people in the future, would be to capture the imagination, and ultimately to destroy the imagination, to remove real, true creativity. Everything just becomes base, becomes degenerate, becomes a copy of a copy of a copy. And that's really where we are today. So what is Disney? It is the magic of the imagination. It's the kingdom of your I forget all the slogans and selling points of Disney, but that's essentially what it is. And so the reason that it holds this grip is precisely because they had figured out a long time ago that people could be won over and enchanted through getting them what they're going.
You've written a lot on and spoken a lot on science fiction, and one of the points that you've made I found is very interesting is that often future technology, or technology that was going to be released like in the 2000s, is put into like a cartoon in the 80s. Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating phenomenon, and that's what I started coming across when I was doing undergraduate and graduate work in this field, was noticing these kinds of trends and patterns. And so, sometimes referred to as predictive programming. And if you doubt this idea, I would say one of the best examples is that you can look at the 1980s G.I. Joe cartoon series, and I will have a more in-depth analysis of this in a coming book. I can't really think of a better example, because this is geared towards, obviously, young American boys. I grew up watching G.I. Joe in the 80s, and it's always stuck with me, all these weird things in these episodes. And then as you get older and you figure out, there actually, there really is technology involved in weather control. There's a G.I. Joe episode about HARP. There's a G.I. Joe episode about mind control. There's G.I. Joe episodes about the Federal Reserve and fiat currency. There's episodes about controlled opposition. So all this stuff is in this goofy 80s cartoon. And when you look into the guy who, Friedman is his name, he has these odd connections. I think you could surmise that he was probably has worked or did work with, in some capacity, the government to some degree, because it's just uncanny that you have these elements in such a silly cartoon. But if you grew up in the 80s, if you're my age, every boy watched G.I. Joe. So what better way to reach the youth than something like this? So in other words, I think what happens is, because so many in-depth studies have been done on humans and anthropology and our psyche, is that the techniques are really scientific, basically. They know what kinds of themes and memes and patterns to put in shows, so that it's kind of implanted in the back of our minds and we don't really think about it, and we're kind of just unconsciously, programmed is, I guess, the best way to put it. But I'm not trying to make it sound like, if you watched a G.I. Joe episode of your kid, you're completely mind controlled. It doesn't really work like that. It's more of a subtle influence of, you don't even remember it, but there was this episode that was telling you that, America's special forces are the good guys and they never do anything wrong, and anything that opposes Americanism is, basically demonized. I'm not, the point about this is not America, but my point is just that, there's pros and cons to America and to any country. Obviously, some are better than others, but the point is just that it really is that sophisticated, and you can look into, the people who do this for a living. There have been entire academic treatises written on this very subject, so it's a real thing. It's a real branch of government research known as propaganda. And how to utilize even the arts for the state.
One of the other points you've made in your discussion of science fiction is the idea of a breakaway civilization. Why would, the Hollywood elite or whoever is creating these movies, why would they show us, like, the bad things that are going to happen to us, that we're going to be put on the robot reservation or whatever it is? Why would they present that to us?
Yeah, that's a good point. One thing I meant to say in the previous point was also that the idea of conditioning us is part of what predictive programming is, and that's kind of really the basic aspect of psychological warfare. Is the target population isn't necessarily some other enemy populace. It may be, but if you are doing psychological warfare, you also want to control your own army and your own populace's perspective. So it's really about worldview manipulation and giving people a worldview. And if you can control that worldview, you have the power. That's really what Sun Tzu said. He said, the way to win the battle is just in the mind, right?
Yes.
What's the G.I. Joe slogan, right? Winning is only half the battle, whatever. Oh. So part of the reason that they show technology, for example, ahead of time is, okay, yeah, conditioning, but if you're conditioning people and you're showing them technology that's been secreted, what effect does that have? Well, it has the effect of you appearing to be far more intelligent and far more powerful than everyone else. So it's really kind of a trick. It's just kind of a, like a magician's game of appearing to have a lot more power than you actually do, but it just because you have the technological secrets that you kind of, withheld for a time period, and it looks like, your technology is 20 years ahead of what is presently available. And actually, Brzezinski describes this technique in his books, Between Two Ages back in 1973, top level geopolitical chess master for the government, Brzezinski's writing about using super advanced technology that nobody knows about. And he mentions in his book things like weather control. So in other words, how did the writers of G.I. Joe and their Pentagon contacts know about things like HAARP and weather control? Well, because high-level government people like Brzezinski had written books about it. And Brzezinski, you could say he's a lifetime actor, I guess, but he figured out how the system worked. And when he wrote that book, Between Two Ages, David Rockefeller read it and recruited him and said, I've got a role for you to play as the head of the Trilateral Commission. So David Rockefeller created the Trilateral Commission with Henry Kissinger for Brzezinski to operate in that capacity. And so in the same way, what these abilities do, we have Isaac Asimov in the Foundation series. He writes in the 1940s or 50s, whenever it is, about the Internet. Now, I think that they probably had the basic idea of the Internet sketched out in the 50s. But as we know, at least nowadays, what's public, the Internet, ARPANET, and so forth, it didn't actually begin to be used until the 60s, we're told. So, in other words, I think that sometimes they can sketch these things out maybe ahead of time and then, put it out there into the mass consciousness or whatever. And I think a lot of times they do this through science fiction. And that has the effect, as I said, of kind of being a symbiotic thing where you not only condition people, but you also kind of get a feedback loop of how people are receptive to this idea. And do you release this idea? Or do you wait a while to release it?
I don't remember if it was you or not who was talking about A Nightmare on Elm Street, but one of the things I remember when I was younger, I would watch like Friday the 13th on USA Network. I don't know if they still have that, but after watching that, I was always afraid that Jason was going to get me in the woods. There is a sense in which, like, these movies, especially horror films, do create a tremendous sense of anxiety and panic, and I see that at a day-to-day basis, like almost like an epidemic of anxiety. I mean, do you see a strong connection between these movies that generate fear, and even video games that generate a sense of fear, and the psychological conditions of so many Americans?
Absolutely. I mean, you can find actual academic research on this. There's plenty of labs that use monkeys. They show the monkeys disturbing images, and they study. I'm not joking.
No,
that's actually a real thing. There's you've heard conspiracy theorists talk about the monkey lab in Bastrop, Texas. That's all 100% real. You can look at the academic papers. And in fact, this is not new either. They were studying the effects of Hitchcock films back at the time. I uncovered this when I was writing my book, that they wanted to know what kind of physical effects horror films have on the body. And it was very similar to, obviously not the same level, but it's kind of similar to the studies that Tavistock did on shell shock. So it's a loose approximation of shell shock or trauma, or kind of putting people in a catatonic state. And yes, it has been studied to the nth degree. They've studied even how to do a car crash in a certain way so that it maximizes the body's inadvertent reactions. So once you start realizing that, you figure out that, man, there's a lot more that goes into movies and entertainment than you ever would have dreamed. And a lot of people find that hard to believe, but I assure you, can Google it, you can find all of the objective, hardcore scientific research on it. It's all true. And yes, they one example of what you're talking about would just simply be mass news reporting on the warfare.
Yes.
Desert Storm was concocted by Rand Corporation as the first attempt at like reality TV warfare. And there's whole Rand studies on this. You can read Alex Abea's book, Soldiers of Reason, where they studied this. And so what that does is it does condition people to be traumatized and desensitizes them. It's the theater of brutality, sometimes called,
yes,
by some analysts. And it's not the same as actually being in the warfare, being traumatized, but it's like a weaker version of that. But if you're consistently subjected to something that's even a weak form of traumatization, that adds up over time. And yes, it causes all kinds of, I think, mental disorders, spiritual disorders, and media and Hollywood and mass news is a huge part of the problem in the modern world, as well as the diet and the drugs and so forth.
What are your thoughts on the Weinstein scandal? I mean, some people have suggested it's sort of like detonating something to cover something else up.
That was kind of where I thought it was going. I thought we were kind of beginning to see some real revelations about what happens, what I think happens probably in the background of Hollywood, dealing with, hardcore stuff, human trafficking, serious stuff like that.
Yes.
And then it just turned into this social justice warrior thing about, women's rights and Me Too and feminism. So I think they diverted it off into feminism, which is the kind of thing that PR agencies will do, that they're good at taking stories and diverting it into something stupid. And actually, believe it or not, there's a whole movie about this, which it's totally a feminist movie, but the movie does make the point. It's called Mrs. Sloan, I think. It's the one with recent movie with Jessica Chastain about this PR company that is in charge of steering stories. So I'm not saying it's a great movie. I'm just saying that the movie does make this point of showing how PR companies steer stories into nonsense and into nothing. So I think that's probably what happened with the recent revelations about Hollywood.
Well, who was the guy who did the X-Men movies? Singer?
Bryan Singer, yeah.
Wasn't he required to step off the set of the film he was making because of something was going on with accusations?
I'm not familiar with him having to step off of the set. I mean, it could be.
I think it was the Harvey Milk biography or something along those lines. But, I mean, I guess basically my question is there more going on in the background than just the Weinstein scandal?
Well, that's what I was saying is that, I think we were going to see things like human trafficking come up, and then I think it got steered off into feminism.
Okay.
But if you watch that documentary, I forget the name. What's that documentary about the pedophilia in Hollywood? I can't remember. It's not Spotlight. I get it mixed up.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Anyway, but yeah, that one covers, I think, what you're talking about.
Okay, well, I just have a couple last questions for you here. What are your thoughts on Donald Trump?
I think he's kind of a mixed bag. I think that there were some good aspects of what Trump talked about. I think the most positive thing with Trump is that he kind of made it a little bit safer in the short term, at least, to not have to be so politically correct. But, I think we're starting to see a lot of backtracking on foreign policy things that were said. I don't like what he's done with Afghanistan troop surge. I think that's wrong. So, I mean, I think it's a better atmosphere than Hillary. But at the same time, I also don't really put a whole lot of stock in the presidency, except for the fact that the way Bernays says, the presidency is really just a powerful media position.
Okay.
So in one sense, it's powerful, but it's only powerful as far as it's kind of related to public perception and media. So Trump calling CNN fake news all the time and New York Times fake news. That's good. That's all positive stuff. But overall, is it really a huge change? Not really. I mean, we're going to see the same degenerate agenda march forward. We're still seeing the Federal Reserve march forward. We're seeing, all kinds of. I mean, again, and that's because, of course, the presidency really doesn't have that. I mean, it has a focal point power, but in terms of power, Trump is just one billionaire, in the midst of, a whole cadre of, people like David Rockefeller and, the people who are far worse, basically.
What about, I know this is a broad term, what about the alt-right? I mean, do you think some of the figures in it are, agents, or that it's a sincere movement, or it's kind of hard to characterize?
I think that it's like all of these kinds of things, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think that what happened in Charlottesville was an indicator that there were probably agents involved to some degree. I'm not going to say that I know for sure who the agents were. I've talked to, interviewed some of these people. Nobody seems to really give evidence of being an agent that I'm aware of that I've talked to. But, there's a lot of alt-right people that I don't know and I've never talked to. And so it's hard to say. I mean, they, I think, kind of shot themselves in the foot by the way they reacted to certain things. So I don't think all of Richard Spencer's moves were very wise. I think if he was really trying to do the best for a movement that he was running or the figurehead of, some of the actions, I think, ended up having detrimental effects to his movement. So, I don't really classify myself as alt-right, not because of fear, but just because, I have a very definite perspective and worldview that I advocate for. And it's orthodox, et cetera, promotes a certain view of, the Bible and so forth. And it really isn't compatible with things like pro-abortion views or Nietzschean type views. And
yes.
So forth and so on. So, I guess the alt-right, from my vantage point, the alt-right is basically just kind of this. I mean, in ways they're better than the alt-right, but in ways the alt-right, to me, it's like, do I want Nietzsche or do I want Thomas Jefferson? I don't really want either one.
Well, just a couple of questions I've always wanted to ask you. You had mentioned one time that you had read that, I have a hard time saying his name, but Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted to sort of seize Christianity, or at least influence it and use it as a vehicle. And so a lot of my research and some of my interviews have come across a lot of contact between Brzezinski and John Paul II. And I even found a picture on the internet of him giving this yes fist clench after John Paul was elected. I mean, to what degree do you think that he was able to influence the church, and do you know anything about his relationship to John Paul II?
Yes, I do. I think Brzezinski is part of what I was referring to earlier as the CIA's, it's called the Doctrinal Warfare Program. It is a real thing. It's not a conspiracy theory. This is people like Henry Luce, C.D. Jackson. Again, David Wemhoff has a 800 or 900 page book that details all of this. And it's 100% correct. Now, how do we explain this? Well, what happened was the CIA and its cohorts had for a long time wanted a means by which they could harness the power and the extent of Roman Catholicism. And with many of the encyclicals that had been written against Americanism and against Freemasonry and so forth, that was somewhat difficult. But what the Cold War did, and I am not saying that I'm pro-communist or anything as ridiculous as that, but a lot of people, especially Catholics, when they hear this discussed, they think, oh, you must like communism. Well, no, what happened was that if you read that book, you can figure out that there were plans to dupe Catholics into becoming Cold Warriors And while I'm sure many of them had good intentions and they were actually fighting real atheistic, bad guys, what happened in the long run is that the institution of the Catholic Church, I believe, ended up basically serving the interests of the people that we're talking about: Brzezinski, Kissinger, William Colby. So, yes, there were not just meetings with Brzezinski, but in fact, John Paul II would frequently meet with William Colby. And William Colby was, CIA head for a while. He was running all kinds of nefarious operations. His underlings, he called them Templars. And again, this is not real committed traditional Catholics. These guys are bad guys.
Yeah.
And that's why you see them pushing forward, again, what's called the doctrinal warfare program. This is the CIA's plan to utilize the Catholic Church. So it didn't begin with Brzezinski. Brzezinski actually just kind of wrote this into, in other words, Brzezinski picked up on this, and the first 50 or 60 pages, I think, between two ages, he talks about this model. But again, that model is what guys like Henry Lewis of Time Magazine, Skull and Bones, C.D. Jackson, these doctrinal warfare guys, had already cooked up before Brzezinski's time. So in other words, Brzezinski just kind of picked up on things, wrote a book that caught the eye of David Rockefeller. So he was kind of put into this powerful position. And so absolutely he met with John Paul II. You're spot on.
What you had a very good analysis of Goonies, and that was probably my favorite movie as a kid. But what are your thoughts on Steven Spielberg? There are a lot, not just in Goonies, but his other movies, a lot of weird kind of child sexual things. I mean, is that just kind of him joking around?
I don't make any accusations about anybody that I can't prove, and I don't have any proof or evidence of anything like that. I think that when you listen to Spielberg talk about his movies, he explains them as kind of him working out his own psychology with issues that he had with his dad and his mom.
Okay.
There's I think it's HBO documentary on Spielberg that's pretty good. It's about 2 or 3 hours. I recommend watching that because it's interviews with the family, with people that worked with him, other directors. So there was kind of like a whole crew of guys like Brian De Palma, Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola. Anyway, some of the other big directors of that time were all kind of hanging out, making movies, and I don't have any proof that they were necessarily up to anything nefarious, but I think what happens is that when you get a lot of wealth and a lot of money, you kind of think that you can save things, you can fix everything, and Spielberg says that younger Spielberg didn't really care about religion, and he claims that later Spielberg kind of got back being interested in Judaism and so forth. So the way that I approached Spielberg in the book was mainly from the aspect of what I think he's probably most known for, which is aliens.
Oh yeah. Well,
Spielberg is really more so about, and I say that because I think that Spielberg has had more influence on aliens than he has through. Like Schindler's List, or what else? Any of his like war movies. I think his main thing that when you say Steven Spielberg, people think of E.T.
Yeah.
They think of alien type stuff.
Well, it's one last question, Jay. I mean, what are your? I know some people have claimed that like Christopher Nolan is trying to like let the people in on the secrets to warn them. But if you watch most of Nolan's movies, they're loaded with at least like a sort of mythological Luciferianism. I don't know if he really is or whatever, but what are your thoughts on Nolan's movies?
Yeah, I think we've covered most of Nolan's films, most of the well-known ones. We did do his student film, Follow, or whatever it is. But I have seen that one. That one's it's kind of neat. It's nothing special, but I don't know that he's necessarily trying to wake everybody up. I think that Christopher Nolan has an interest in Carl Jung and his brother, who sometimes writes the films with him. They definitely like psychoanalysis and, to some degree, Carl Jung's archetypes and that kind of stuff. That comes up very frequently in the films. But as to whether there's necessarily an attempt to wake people up, I don't have any evidence of that. But I just kind of look at it like, well, what filmmakers are utilizing some degree of esoteric concepts, and certainly I think Nolan fits into that category where he is definitely on some level using esoteric concepts, much like Darren Aronofsky uses quite a bit of Kabbalistic ideology. Some directors, will use Platonic ideology at times. It just kind of depends, but yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say that he's necessarily trying to wake people up. But he could be. He could have a view that, well, let me give you an example. Sometimes people think if they're influenced by, say, a Far Eastern ideology, Buddhism or Hinduism, they might believe the notion of awakening or enlightenment. So what they might want to do through a film like Inception is wake people up from their dream state. So it's very possible that with Inception he thought he might be waking people up. But again, it's always hard to know people's motives, why they're doing stuff, why exactly they're making this movie. Is it just to make money? Is it a piece of art? And I think that with human beings, our motives are oftentimes complex. It's not all one thing. So, I try to focus usually on the story and the symbolism rather than trying to get in the mind of the director, unless it happens to be relevant in a specific case. Like, I think sometimes in order to understand a David Lynch film, you do kind of have to get into David Lynch's mind and understand his worldview about, meditation and, Far Eastern thought or something like that.
Okay, well, Jay, I'm very thankful for you coming on. It's been very informative. How can people support your work?
Yeah, if you go to jaysanalysis.com, there's a subscription option for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year, where you get access to basically all the archives, which is tons of lectures, hours and hours of interviews, videos. And then there's also the option to purchase the book. You can get signed copies of the book from me. That at least is a better way to support the author than Amazon. Amazon has authors. So I would recommend, if you do want the book, which is 363 pages, 404 footnotes, deals with everything from Hitchcock to Spielberg to Kubrick, kind of the big blockbuster type directors that we're familiar with in their movies, get it from me. And then if you're interested in the TV show, it's been now 20 episodes. They're all about 30 minutes a piece. And it's basically this kind of stuff. We basically just go down the list, going through, Christopher Nolan movies, Roman Polanski, Spielberg, Kubrick, David Lynch, same type of stuff.
Okay, well, Jay, thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Okay, thank you.